Everyone, and welcome to the Scaling Solutions Towards Shifting Systems webinar. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to get started right now. I just want to remind everybody that this webinar will be recorded. We will have an opportunity later on for questions and answers by entering questions into the Q&A box that you should see at the bottom of your screen, or in the chat box, which is also in the bottom of your screen. Before we get started, I just want to invite everyone to change their name by clicking on their photo, clicking on their name on the participants tab on the upper right-hand side of your screen, and clicking on the three dots over there and pressing rename. If everyone could please do that and rename their name to their name, their organization, and their location if they want, that would be great. And Heather, with that, I'm going to take it over to you.
Thank you, Caroline. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. I'm Heather Grady. I'm a Vice President at Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. I'm based in the San Francisco Bay Area. We are marking the launch of the third report in our Scaling Solutions Toward Shifting Systems initiative. And as some of you know, we've had dozens of convenings and workshop sessions over the last 4 years to both learn from others and to disseminate our learnings. But this is the time of COVID-19, and most of us are not traveling, so this is our first virtual launch. Let me first introduce our wonderful panelists who we'll hear from today. Next slide. Aishwarya Anantha Padmanabhan works at Edelgive Foundation in India, where she's responsible for managing and building value in key funder-partner relationships in the women's empowerment domain. She also attended the Scaling Solutions workshop we had in India. Kathy Rich is the director of the Build program at the Ford Foundation. She's a steering group member of Scaling Solutions, and she attended the Assessing Systems Change workshop that we had in Connecticut last July. Maria Claudia Santos Camargo leads the selection, monitoring, and evaluation processes and capacity building activities at Fundación Arturo y Enrique Cesana in Colombia. She also attended the Assessing Systems Change workshop and a Scaling Solutions workshop we held in Colombia earlier this year. Edwin O is the Managing Director of Funder Alliances at the Skoll Foundation. He was one of the driving forces behind the inception of this initiative, and he attended our workshop in Colombia and is also a steering group member. And Georgia Pessoa is the CEO of Instituto Humanize in Brazil. She's been working in this field of philanthropy and focusing a lot on the environment for many years. She also attended the Assessing Systems Change workshop that we had last year. Next slide. So we could easily spend 3 hours on this report launch, but we know that video conferences are tiring and all of you are doing a lot of Zoom calls. So we're aiming to pack a lot into just 75 minutes. First, I'm going to share some highlights of the new report that was principally written by colleagues at Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. Then we'll exchange perspectives with our panelists on seeing, facilitating, and assessing systems change. We'll have a poll in the middle for your views on priority actions, a quick question and answer, and then at the end, another poll where you can invite us to do future webinars on specific themes or geographies. Next slide. So this initiative was launched in 2016. Our intent is to encourage funders to work more collaboratively to place longer-term, more adaptive and responsive resources with their program partners to scale their solutions and impact, so that we can really address the most pressing systemic challenges the world is facing. This new report summarizes the earlier recommendations and findings from 2016 to 2018, including a set of 5 recommendations for funders. Next slide. And those are to streamline your giving as a funder, to collaborate more with other funders, to accelerate your impact through non-monetary support, to learn more about systems change, and to empower your grantees to really shift the power dynamics between funder and grantee. Next slide. So this report focuses, as I said, on seeing, facilitating, and assessing our contributions to systems change. And while some systems change experts would undoubtedly find this report light and only scratching the surface, and I must agree, we hope that for anyone who's not working on systems change day to day, not deeply steeped in these approaches already, that any of you will find it a useful guide for learning and action. And today is really just a quick dip into this field. So over the course of 18 months and workshops in several countries, we came out with 5 major findings. The first one is that a common challenge for funders trying to understand the systems they're aiming to change is striking a balance between 2 priorities. On the first hand, recognizing a system's complexity and dynamism, but on the other hand, synthesizing and simplifying a system to facilitate program planning and to fit into existing grant-making processes. Secondly, funders and program partners aim for different types of systems change. As many have said, there's incremental change, change within existing rules. There's reform, change to existing rules, and transformation, creation of entirely new rules. But each type of change entails distinct tactics, priorities, and time horizons. Third, of all the data collected for projects supported by philanthropy, most is on inputs and outputs or short-term incomes. Very little of the data illuminates whether and how our funding contributes to long-term and systemic change. And I just want to point out that we have a diagram there on the right from the report from a wonderful funder collaborative called the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. And they have worked with Blue Marble Evaluation and others to really do a great job of seeing, facilitating, and assessing systems change. Next page. 2 more findings: that the growing interest in systems change presents a wonderful opportunity to confront these challenges together in new ways. And finally, that monitoring and evaluation that's attached to philanthropic funding is normally tied to short-term discrete projects and very linear models of change. So the benefits of good evaluation practice can't be tapped enough to explore what systems change is. It requires more holistic and adaptive approaches. And I will add that here, this diagram shows an exercise that we did in a workshop on assessing systems change. It's a timeline of how the housing crisis emerged in such a dire way in the San Francisco Bay Area. And in working on systems change, there's a lot of use of visual means and diagrams. So these are just a couple of examples we're showing. Next page, please. So we then came up with, in this third report, 6 recommendations. The first is to engage stakeholders, be rigorous and collaborative in gathering and analyzing evidence, and exchange lessons with others. That's essential for promoting and scaling best practices in systems change. Secondly, by mapping the systems they aim to change, funders and program partners will better see how systems function, where promising leverage points exist, and where there are opportunities for intervention. Also, where there may be unintended consequences, which we all know happens from funding. Again, on the right is a diagram. This is called an iceberg model, and we use this as an iceberg exercise in several of our workshops. And the idea that what Donella Meadows would say is the deeper you go under the iceberg, under the tip of the iceberg, to looking at mental models, our values, our attitudes and beliefs, the more deeply you'll be able to influence changes in a system. The third recommendation is that funders become part of the systems in which they intervene when we enter and depart. So we have to be more sensitive to this influence and incorporate it into funding consideration, managing it to the greatest extent possible. Next page. The fourth recommendation was that although philanthropy can be instrumental in catalyzing significant change, funders and their partners will often need to engage government to recognize and ideally scale their work. And we see this a lot more in emerging markets and the global south, a bit less when we see funders from the north funding into other countries. But government, we found, is a crucial partner in most cases. The fifth, similarly, involving the private sector more, not just as a target, but an ally, but they are very important in terms of economic and other dimensions. So involving them more is important. And then our final recommendation is that we believe that strategies that emphasize streamlined giving, interorganizational and cross-sector collaboration, active learning, and deference to the experience-based expertise of grantees is really important in systems change. So this harks back to our very first report and our scale recommendations. That means that shifting systems begins with a systemic shift in the very sectors, in the philanthropic sector's own funding models. So that's quite important. So this was a lot, but I want to further illuminate these points by asking each of our panelists a different question. So I'm going to start with Edwin from the Skoll Foundation. Edwin, can you share, you and your colleagues, as I mentioned earlier, you were really crucial in the inception of this work. You've been supporters of this from the beginning. And I must say, at the outset, we never imagined we'd be living in a time like now in COVID-19, and also with the enormous upswell in support for racial justice and the movement building that's been taking place. In what ways do you think this work that we've been doing over the last 18 months can inform either existing or new funders about how they do philanthropy and perhaps even impact investing? Over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Heather. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. First, let me start by thanking RPA, especially Heather, Kelly, Joanne, Nama, and Patrick for this opportunity to learn alongside each other and with other funders. This report represents a lot of hard work, and it's all underpinned by a desire for real and enduring change. And let me thank all of you who have taken the time to join us today and my esteemed colleagues on this virtual panel. Before I try to answer Heather's question, let me quickly try to introduce myself and the Skoll Foundation. Skoll is a 20-year-old private foundation based in California and was founded by Jeff Skoll. Jeff was the founding president of the tech company eBay. Our goal is to support solutions that can tackle some of the toughest problems in the world at greater scale, potentially at the level of the very systems that keep these wicked problems so entrenched. In these 2 decades, we've financially supported these entrepreneurial solutions, largely through multi-year grants to 116 organizations, which we call Skoll awardees. We've also held conferences throughout the year, including the annual Skoll World Forum on Social Entrepreneurship, which we've held 17 times. And we seek to share evidence-based stories about these solutions, all to accelerate the scaling, uptake, and support of these solutions beyond the limits of our own resources. As Heather mentioned, I run our efforts to openly share and collaborate with other funders, especially those who align with us in values and purpose. So to Heather's question, at Skoll, we've long recognized that we're just but one funder, and as so, we are insufficient to fully resourcing large-scale change. Success cannot be defined by our own transactions. Otherwise, we run the risk of pushing program partners off an ever steeper resource cliff. Meanwhile, the problems are getting even larger and more urgent. As Heather mentioned, take COVID-19, a pandemic that reveals how interconnected these issues are, ranging from broken healthcare systems to deep-seated inequity across marginalized communities, causing disproportionately greater disease burden. Over the past 4 years, we've funded a few organizations which have scaled their solutions to build the capacity of community health workers to sustainably provide health coverage to 7 million people in 3 African countries. And we've also bet bigger on 2 of them, Last Mile Health and Living Goods, to work in partnership with national governments and other local actors to bring coverage to 34 million people across 5 countries. But with the pandemic spread this year, how do you mobilize even more actors to more quickly detect and address a virus that does not recognize national boundaries in a continent of 1.2 billion people? So we're talking relativity and we're talking urgency here. How do you do so in ways that enable detection of and preparedness for future pandemics, as well as the strengthening of those very health systems in the long run? And how do you support such efforts when you're a funder sitting an ocean away? In my own 12 years at Skoll, I think I've arrived at more of such questions than actual answers. More than 3 years ago, RPA gathered a group of us funders to ponder such questions related to supporting promising solutions with the potential to transform or perhaps even reimagine entire systems. What has emerged is the Scaling Solutions Initiative as an open learning journey that aspires to engage philanthropic peers and their program partners in collective learning and sharing before, during, and after collective action. I think it's why I'm especially appreciative of this most recent report out. It doesn't claim to have all the answers. As you've heard, it offers a framework for how to learn, towards identifying what solutions to support, how to better support them, and to what end. It also tries to encourage funders to do so collaboratively, not only alongside peers, but also in design with multi-sector partners and stakeholder communities. So back to COVID-19. In many ways, the thinking represented in this report on seeing, facilitating, and assessing desired change has very much aligned with Skoll's ongoing response to the pandemic. As but one example, there has been intense and open collaboration among funders to see the opportunities for not only pandemic response, but also broader health system strengthening. In one emergent effort, we're helping to rally a group of peers to facilitate the scale-up and capacity building of the 3-year-old Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, as well as its regional detection networks, governmental partnerships with member states, and partnerships with those organizations, including Skoll awardees, who can further activate community health workers. Our facilitation comes in the form of unrestricted capacity building funding, as well as helping to engage other funders and corporate partners on behalf of the Africa CDC to take on some ownership of this burden. Assessing what will change includes empowering program partners to define the milestones that matter, encouraging them to take risks and learn and apply both failures and successes, as well as work together to marshal and share evidence of what's working as fodder for potential private and public sector engagement. In short, we are trying to support the efforts of African leaders to scale up and sustain African solutions for Africa. As a side note, we are also supporting the deployment and scale up of some of these very solutions, like contact tracing in the US, given there's so much work to be done here and much to already learn from what's been working in Africa. Finally, we at Skoll are invoking such processes of learning and scoping to extend our pandemic response into South Asia and Latin America. My hope is that this example gives our audience some flavor for how they can not only harness what's in the report for their own use, but also join us in continuing this journey. I especially want to encourage funders who are not only newer to funding, but also who are rich in representation and proximity to the very stakeholder communities and other actors of these systems. We have so much to learn from, with, and each other, from and with each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Edwin. That was really helpful framing, I think, and the examples from your foundation are very good ones that illuminate what we're talking about. Next, I'd like to ask a question of Maria Claudia from the Sasana Foundation in Colombia. Maria Claudia, you joined our workshop in Connecticut last July on assessing systems change with another colleague. And at that workshop, we went very rapidly through a peer exchange process of seeing, facilitating, and assessing systems change. We packed a lot into those 3 days. And then we met up again in Bogota in February to delve more deeply into the theme of narrowing the rural equity gap in Colombia. So can you share how you've used some of the approaches and tools that are described in the report for your work on aging and the elderly?
Of course. Thank you, Heather, and I'll try to be brief to let more time for questions. According to your question, I refer to this report especially on the first step, seeing systems change. That is at where we are right now, again, because it's been an iterative process. In July, when we met at the workshop in Connecticut, we presented a map that was made by the foundation. We already had an incipient strategy, and we were there to learn the assessment of systemic change so we can figure out how to evaluate our outcomes. But what we understood in that workshop was that our map was missing a key component that is mentioned in this report. And I quote, "Systems appear different depending on the observer. Stakeholders bring different perspectives to any given issue and can have vastly different incentives, leading them to pursue distinct agendas. Seeing systems requires sensitivity to this diversity of stakeholders' positions and perspectives, especially those of marginalized groups." And we realized that we had only a partial understanding of the system with the map we built, and that if we really wanted to understand the aging system in Colombia, it was absolutely essential to integrate diverse stakeholders, and not only to share with them our map to see if it makes sense for them, but to make them part of from the beginning of the mapping process. So we restarted the process in January, convinced that it was the best decision so we can narrow our system in a more inclusive way and try to build the environment to let collective intelligence start to emerge. We invited to the process older persons, of course, academia, entrepreneurs, economists, social leaders, religious caregivers, family caregivers, geriatricians, gerontologists, journalists, funders, international networks, anthropologists, psychologists, public sector, among others. And together we are building a new map that is more sophisticated and with more forces and interconnections than the first one. It's been a great experience, and it is the first time all stakeholders relating to aging system in Colombia are working together, allowing an inter-silos knowledge exchange that breaks barriers. For example, it was very interesting working around the silver economy loop, and it creates a very interesting debate between social actors and geriatricians versus the economists and entrepreneurs around important concepts like the diversity in aging and how it becomes invisible in the market offering for older persons. Sometimes it can be frustrated and chaotic, all these different perspectives and approaches in a process. But in that particular example, it was very interesting to allow these different perspectives that shows us the enablers and inhibitors we were not aware of before, and how it's all interconnected. So I would like to quote another important concept from the report. Interrelationships are the formal and informal links, exchanges, and interdependencies among system components. Webs of interrelationships are what make complex systems difficult to change. As such, they are important to understand in the early stages of planning and interventions. And this is a very important part of our mapping, where we find voids or components that we can't understand well. We search for experts or information that can give us a wider understanding, and then in a participatory session, we analyze these connections. During this collective work, we've noticed that participation are changing mindsets. That is very important for this approach because it will demand collective actions as well. We are learning together in the mapping process. For example, it's been hard for everyone to understand that we can't impose the change and we can't judge which part is wrong and which part is good. The only thing we can do is try to map the forces and its connections, how it works, and try to unlock the forces that could cause the system to change itself and to create healthier outcomes, the ones we want to see. Right now, we are in the middle of the mapping process, building a physical visualization of the system, where we hope to find some opportunities of leverage and could use it to build our strategy and theory of change for the next 10 years. This map will have an open source so everyone can have access, and part of the process is helping other stakeholders to find their opportunities of leverage so we can facilitate the articulation between participants. So as you can see, Heather, this report and the previous ones and the workshop we had participated has been key resources for us. It gave us the push so we can begin our journey, and we hope we can share the rest of the process with you. And we are very interested in receiving feedback and keep learning from this great community of systemic change. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about your work is we sometimes forget the convening power of funders and all the different stakeholders that you brought together. And it might be difficult for an individual grantee or a group of grantees to do that, and program partners or the government. So I think your doing it was really special, and also setting up the collaboration rather than the competition that we often see. Thank you. So I want to turn next to Georgia Pessoa from Instituto Humanize in Brazil. You also joined this Assessing Systems Change workshop last July, and you brought some of the challenges and opportunities facing you in Brazil. And I might say Brazil, like the United States, is a country in some turmoil right now on a lot of different levels. A lot of your work has been around protecting the Amazon and protecting Brazil's environmental resources. So how and why do you think systems change approaches are important in philanthropy, and how are you, Georgia, using those in your work in Brazil and elsewhere? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Heather. It's a pleasure to be here. And well, right now in Brazil, I think system changes approaches are important for philanthropy. I think, first of all, the social and environmental issues that philanthropic organizations are facing right now are complex, and so the solution package to address them. We have an assumption that the solution will not be addressed by one institution alone or nor by one sector isolated. We also believe that the results of our action are much higher when we bring government, private sector, multilateral agencies together with other philanthropies to co-create a process to find a solution or baby steps towards the solution that we envision. So we think that strategic funders understand the need to underline causes overreaching power dynamics by shifting systems. And I think there's a very important role for us to address that. What we are trying to do in our case, I didn't say much about Humanize, but Humanize, it's a new foundation in Brazil. We launched our work about 3 years ago, and we are trying to address sustainable use of our natural resources in Brazil, working with social impact, public affairs, and in target geographies in Brazil, some parts of the Amazon, rainforest biomes, and some parts of the savannas in Brazil. So this is our work, trying to, together with other partners, implementers and funders, to co-create things. So a way to share our learning journey in Brazil, which is it's very important to be part of networks like this one, like other things that RPA has been helping philanthropies to share what we have been doing, our creation processes, and also fast tracking other things, learning from other foundations and philanthropies around the globe. So this is amazing, being part of this network. It's very important for us. But what we're trying to do here in Brazil with other funders, other philanthropies, is pretty much work with different angles on this thing. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to work close to influence different ways towards system change, but understanding that we are all part of this ecosystem. So at Humanize, we are working pretty close to other 20 foundations and institutes in Brazil and outside of Brazil, trying to co-create different pillars to address public affairs, to address sustainable use of natural resources, to work on more sustainable cities, and using different angles, GovTech and other ways to address that. So we have more than 10 different partnerships on that regard, and internally we call them alliances, strategic partnerships, or even co-funding partnerships where we have a portfolio of grants that we share. Another thing that would be great to share with you guys is an incipient program that we have been developing, which is a strengthening of NGOs in Brazil program. And in this program, we are addressing 4 things that are very important for us. One is system thinking. So how the organizations are addressing their inspirational side of the organization, how they are building the organization on system thinking, on strategic thinking. So this is one pillar of the program. The other pillar is strategic planning. So how they are implementing and actually developing and implementing their strategies and in a very different tools to address that. A third pillar is technical capacity. what is actually the NGO delivering in terms of the capacity that they're saying that they're doing, and what is the kind of help enhancing their abilities, their capacity that we can provide together with them. And the fourth one is management skills. So how can we help with all different levels of management skills in the organization? So Humanize, we have over 100 projects internally. So this is part of our own portfolio. And then outside with the partnership with other funders, we have a bunch of other, I would say 100, that together with other funders, we are developing and co-funding these projects with other implementers on different parts of the things. So this is pretty much where we are in terms of the way that we see things. I think another important thing to share is an example of when we put a loop on the Amazon region, main obstacle. I think we acknowledge that there's a huge complexity over there, but we also define our scope of action, trying to address what could be done in terms of social impact business. How can we help monitoring deforestation? How can we provide support to state government on different things? So right now, there's this great opportunity on a consortium of the 9 state governments in the Amazon. So how can we help them to put together a strong plan and have a group of people, because the Amazon doesn't consider the boundaries, the forestry and the whole thing is it's one thing. And so we are trying to do different things, but I think working at the state and municipal level right now in Brazil, it shows a good angle to help, especially addressing all different things, because it's health, but it's education in illegality and all different things that we are trying to work together with our partners. But again, I think if we understand that the system is one, and together with other powers, private sector, governments, and other philanthropies and multilateral agencies, we can do something different. And I think the question for philanthropy right now, I think it's what is our role? And we had a lot of different things to address before the pandemic. What is happening right now in Brazil with this 20 other funders is, together with our plans for the year, we are having to face the challenge to open more space to address the urgency agenda and helping governments and people actually with the health package on the emergency agenda. And this is challenging, but it's also a great way to bring other level of creativity among ourselves, to say, hey, we have to be open for new ways to do things, and it doesn't matter if it's a different level of things that we have to add to the work that we are doing. And I think there's a very important thing now to learn, and as fast as we learn with this crisis, because it's a health crisis, it's an economic crisis. We are getting ready for one of the worst recessions I think that we have been facing in humankind. And next year and the following one will be tough on us. And what is the role for philanthropy right now? And I think, how can we work differently? And networks like this one is so inspiring, and I need this really bad. And I'm so glad to be a part of this panel. And I'll stop here to open space for questions and collaborative thinking on the way out. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you so much, Georgia. And I know you use the word co-creation, and I think that is really a hallmark of how you and your foundation work. I know Georgia invited us at RPA to do some work with her, and we said that would be great. And then before we knew it, she invited 4 other funders. So now we work with a consortium of 5 Brazilian foundations, which is not the same. It takes more in terms of time for building partnerships, but it's well worth it. And I think, Georgia, your comments really reflect that. Yeah, there's value in that time given to that relationship building. I now want to turn to Aishwarya from the Edelgive Foundation in India. You joined our thought-provoking workshop in India on promoting gender equality. And we planned that with Ashoka University, with the Center for Civil Society and Philanthropy. And at the beginning, I was quite daunted when Ashoka said, let's do it on gender equality, because as we all know, India has many of the world's most amazing and well, groundbreaking feminist women's rights leaders and women's movement. Nevertheless, I think participants seemed to find that we broke some new ground and we worked in some new ways that were helpful. So can you share with us from that workshop just what we did and what you found most useful that others could learn from? Thanks, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Heather, firstly, for inviting me to this very esteemed panel. I'm very honored to be speaking among such prolific speakers. And secondly, I would like to really congratulate you and the RPA team for the amount of insights that you've generated through your scaling systems reports and workshops. It's been a huge source of insights for young foundations like ours. We're literally just a little more than a decade old. And we've sort of learned along the way. We've made our mistakes and we've sort of learned from our mistakes. And I think panels like these and workshops like the ones that you do have been really instrumental for us in sort of building our knowledge and our theories of practice, really. So when I attended the Delhi workshop, I was very excited to be one of the young foundations joining the workshop, also because we've always adopted a systems lens to our practices and to our programs. And I was sort of excited and also wary about whether we're actually heading on the correct lines. And I was very reassured to see that we were thinking pretty much on the lines of many other foundations while they were adopting systems lens to their programming. For example, to tell you a bit about what Edelgive does. So we are a corporate foundation. We're a young corporate foundation. We work in education, livelihoods, and women empowerment. And along the way, we realized the power of collaborations. We realized there's a plethora of social issues out there, and we cannot do everything alone. And that was, I think, a very breakthrough sort of realization for us. And that was also why we started reaching out to other funders like the Ford Foundation, like the Gates Foundation. We also started reaching out to other funders who sort of shared the same values that we shared, and also prompted a lot of peer learning and co-sharing and helped us craft a lot of our programs in each of these three portfolios. For example, in the gender space, because the workshop that I attended was on gender equality, we run a coalition co-crafted with the Ford Foundation called the Coalition for Women Empowerment. And the whole premise of the coalition stemmed from the fact that even within the gender landscape, there are so many issues that are not really covered. So while economic empowerment is very easily picked up as a funding theme, but when it comes to issues like violence against women or access to legal justice or domestic violence, agency building or social justice or grassroots leadership, these are issues which are not really picked up by a lot of domestic philanthropies, by a lot of corporates who want to do their corporate social responsibility through these programs. And that was when we realized that we really need a concentrated effort to sort of support this kind of grassroots programs on ground, and simultaneously also build a feminist narrative and strengthen the feminist narrative in the country, whereby we're actually ensuring that grassroots organizations which are working on these issues are strengthened. So it also tied in with the approach that we take at Edelgive, that we're not just funders, but we also do work or like to co-work with our grantee partners, even on their institutional strengthening, on their organizational development. And that was what steered the sort of the creation of an idea of a coalition in the women empowerment space. We had one in education, but in education it was pretty straightforward in terms of there are indicators which are very straightforward, measurement indicators are standardized. But when we come to gender equality, how do we measure, and who are we to compare whether a woman is empowered for that matter? So our challenge started from there. How do we define empowerment? And we, in our very rudimentary way, we started basically putting together an equation of sorts that, okay, for us, women empowerment might mean social and economic empowerment. And a lot of the learning that we sort of crystallized was from the collective of organizations we worked with. So we had a very robust collective of nonprofits who are very grassroots driven, who are community led and community owned. And most of our data on what are the key challenges that we should be looking at actually came from these organizations. And organically, once we had the framework in place, we knew what we were talking about. We also went out and started looking at like-minded funder partners who might want to, resonate with our vision. And we were ecstatic when we found that in Ford Foundation. And it's been more than a year of our partnership with them. And it's been an immense journey of learning for us, because from a legacy foundation like a Ford, who comes in with its set of nomenclature and of narratives, and imbibing that for us as a young foundation gave us immense source of insights. So right now, the coalition as we run it, it's a vibrant multi-stakeholder group, which I think has systems thinking and systems approaches right at the core of it, because we're all doing what we're best at. So we know that our entire set of data and knowledge that programs have to be based on come from this robust group of organizations at the grassroots who give us data right from, say, on cases of violence, or on what approaches have worked very well, and also on beneficiary feedback, if I may say beneficiary feedback, in terms of what processes are actually effective on ground. And on the other hand, we have funder partners like the Ford Foundation. We have another family foundation which has joined us now, who come in with their set of knowledge and who are actually helping us not just learn from them, but also sort of distill learnings from this grassroots collective and disseminate it further. So we are in a space right now where we are co-learning, we are co-sharing. We know that there is a strong contribution that we are being able to put in for this group of grassroots organizations on the ground. In a way, we're trying to create a stronger feminist narrative, which is getting very diluted, say, even now when we see in the COVID pandemic, for that matter. So when you spoke about how vibrant the feminist movement has been in India, it has been, and it has been a source of great hope for us, especially when we're seeing cases of violence rise at the time of this lockdown. And our source of data, or our source of insights of what interventions are needed at this point, and what probably would need to be put in place for a longer sort of sustained social transformation, has actually come to us from our organization. So they were the ones who told us that we foresee, given the experiences of other pandemics, we foresee that this is going to be a huge it's going to take a huge toll on the women's rights movement in India. And it will mean that cases of violence are going to increase. It will mean women will lose out jobs. It will mean that girls will drop out of school. Child marriages will increase. So in a way, like the iceberg model that we learned about, of structures and of process and of mental models, for that matter, in this case, all our programs right now are looking at shifting those mental models, because you can't just hit the tip of the iceberg. You really need to delve deep into what are the root causes of the problem, or why is violence increasing when lockdowns are in place, and why are women and girls bearing the most brunt of it. So in a way, we've got that in terms of that data in place. Our source of data has been our grassroots partners. On the other end, what we have also learned is the fact that this, while of course it's a shadow pandemic, there are women's rights and feminist narratives which are going to be affected. On the other end, their funding is going to be affected for the organizations which are actually leading this work. So we know for a fact that most of the organizations, while on one end are extending their operations into relief operations, into ensuring food relief, into ensuring helplines, on the other hand, they are at risk of losing out the existing funding that they already have. And we know that it's not just about program funding alone, right? Like already a lot of funding is going into COVID funding without a gender lens in place. So there is this huge bulk of funding which is just for COVID, but where are the women and girls in them? and even what happens to the organizations which are actually pushing the narrative for the women and girls who are invisibilized. So while on one end, we're ensuring that our funding and our funding commitments to our grantee partners is also taking into consideration that they have to make their programs more flexible, and we are trying to free up budgets where they can actually channelize them into relief programs benefiting women and girls. On the other hand, we're also working on ensuring their resilience is safeguarded, that these organizations do not die out in this whole stress of actually meeting these additional vulnerabilities. We're working on trying to spread the message as far and wide that you need to work on institutional strengthening of these organizations, because if they are not going to be there, the change that you're envisaging at the last mile is not going to happen. So a major part of our COVID relief, if we may say, has been on not just raising awareness on where women and girls need to be protected through interventions. It has also been on building resilience of these organizations, on staying alive, on surviving this, not just in the short run, but also in the long run. So just to sort of conclude what I'm saying, I think my key takeaways definitely from the Delhi workshop was the shield model, because I think how we have rejigged our entire intervention in the COVID during the COVID pandemic time has been on streamlining grant making, has been on collaborating more effectively, spreading the word, has been on accelerating impact on not just monetary support, but also on non-monetary support. And at the end, I think we've been hearing the partners that we work with, be it our funder partners like Ford, or be it our grantee partners on ground. And I think be it the iceberg model or be it Shield, I feel very relieved that what we're doing in terms of practice does have some roots in systems change theory, which I could learn from the workshop. So thank you so much for inviting me to that workshop, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. It's been a fabulous experience.
Thank you, Aishwarya. You made so many good points, and I think underscored some of the points that others made earlier. I would just say it's interesting, on the first day of our workshop, we realized in New Delhi that there was another workshop going on at exactly the same time that was around evaluation. And we had someone at that workshop, a woman who's an economist in India, and she came to ours and she said it was strange because they were measuring women's empowerment strictly on their economic dimension, and they weren't giving any attention to violence against women and so on. So I think your points about sort of the intersectionality and the overlap and the need to really look more comprehensively are quite important. Thank you. Kathy, can I come to you right now? So Kathy Rich, many of you know her. Like Edwin and the Skoll Foundation, Kathy and the Ford Foundation have been members of our steering group for this initiative since the early days in 2016. And you've joined a number of our workshops. You've also been very supportive of the pledge, the Council on Foundations pledge, that is asking funders to be far more flexible and longer term thinking in what they're giving in terms of the COVID crisis. So you've been in philanthropy a long time. What chances do you give the philanthropy sector of really adopting the kind of changes that we're talking about today, from streamlining grantee procedures to shifting power dynamics to thinking more holistically? What would be your recommendations for changing the system of philanthropy faster? Kathy, over to you.
Well, thank you. And I'll start with an apology. Of course, after being completely quiet for this entire webinar, my dog has started barking. So apologies for any background noise there. Look, I think the imperative to change is certainly there, and that's why we're all on this call today. I think from the COVID crisis to the crisis of systemic racism in the United States, it's clear that fundamental political, economic, and social systems are failing us, right? And that funders need to be bold to help our societies avoid sheer catastrophe at this point. And it's equally clear that instead of being part of the solution, funders have been part of the problem for far too long. We've held too tightly to our funds in ways that stifle innovation. We think that the answers have rested within our institutions as opposed to within broader systems. And I think too often we've seen ourselves as somehow outside the systems that we're trying to change, acting upon those systems rather than realizing we're actually part of the systems. And I think that attitude keeps us from being true partners and collaborators with those who are trying to solve the very problems that, that we want to solve the most. But I do think that this is changing really rapidly, as are so many things right now in this era that we're living in. In the past 4 months, we've seen funder after funder upend their old ways of doing business. So just a couple of examples. One is in March, which was during the first week of New York's COVID shutdown. The Ford Foundation worked with a small handful of other funders to draft a call to action philanthropy's commitment to COVID-19, which you can find on the Council on Foundations website. The pledge called for many of the practices that we are talking about today and that Scaling Solutions has advocated for years, including making grants as unrestricted as possible, supporting organizations that are created and led by communities that are most affected by COVID, committing to listening to those communities least heard, lifting up their voices and experiences to inform our public discourse and our own foundation's decision making, and really learning from these practices so that we can make them permanent, so that we really can shift our way of working more fundamentally in the future in stable times, not just in crisis times. To date, more than 700 foundations have signed this pledge, and similar pledges are now circulating in China, in India, in Hong Kong, and among individual donors in the United States. So that's one example. Another example is at the Ford Foundation. We were very much affected by the calls for philanthropy to spend more during this time, and to really inject new resources at a time when they are needed most. So we took the unprecedented step of issuing our first ever social justice bond, which is backed by our endowment and has raised $1 billion. And we are using those proceeds to double our grant making over the next 18 months. We're very pleased that 4 other major foundations also announced at the same time that they would be issuing bonds. And we certainly hope that foundations all over the world are thinking about not just how we redouble our efforts to listen, to engage with communities, to map and understand systems, but we really put our money where our mouths are on this. My friend Anthony Bug-Levine, who runs the Nonprofit Finance Fund here in the United States, recently observed that he'd seen more progress on funder change in the first 2 weeks of New York's COVID crisis than he'd seen in the last 10 years. I think that the possibilities for all of us to fundamentally change our practice and truly support systems change is higher now than it's ever been. And so the question I would have to all of the panelists and to the folks in chat who have raised some of these questions already is, what is our role? What is the best, most constructive role we can play right now? And what are we prepared to do?
Thank you, Kathy. That was thought-provoking, and I think Anthony is quite right. There's been so much change recently. We were going to do breakout rooms, but we can't, and we're a little pressed for time. So what we're going to do instead is display a poll, and we want to get some ideas from you. Remember, this webinar today is really a taster of our report. And so we would like you to answer the question now to help us with future planning. Based on what you've heard, what is one funding practice that you're inspired to do more of or push your funders to do more of in the future? You can enter any comments with specific examples if you like, but the first one is that idea of streamlining grant making and investment process for more unrestricted funding. The second is collaborating more effectively by sharing knowledge and due diligence with others, accelerating impact through non-monetary support, learning about the key levers for systems change, and the last one is about changing dynamics between funders and grantees. So please, in light of our most recent report, think about which of these you think is most important, and you have a minute to share your answer and push the submit button. And then we'll see what you say. Caroline, how are we doing with responses? We have 121 participants.
As of now, we have 80 responses, so I just closed the poll.
Okay, let's see what people said. Let's see, so 37% are want to work on streamlining grant making processes. 20% collaborating more effectively amongst funders. 9% is about non-monetary support. 20%, so again, a fifth about learning more about systems change, and 14% for empowering, changing power dynamics between funders and grantees. So looks like top of the list is the streamlining. And so that very much fits, I think, with what we've been saying in this third report about systems change, that strategy by the funder and grantees and program partners needs to be adaptable. So let's, I think, Caroline, can you go to the next slide? We're going to have now, we have a bit of time for a Q&A with our speakers. I think we can actually stop screen sharing. And if all of you go on gallery view, we'll be able to see, you will be able to see all of our panelists. I think maybe first I'll ask Maria Claudia. One of the questions that came in was, what is the role of philanthropy? What can philanthropy do that the government cannot? So if we take a specific area, like you're working on aging and the elderly in Colombia, why can't the government take care of that? What is the added value of your foundation and other philanthropy actors in that?
Thank you. Well, right now, I think the most important thing philanthropy can do that government can't is taking risks, is accelerating the processes, is talking about the mistakes and the and sharing and and make this collaboration happens. I think the philanthropy in our area of work, it's being very passive and disarticulated. So we are, with this mapping process, we are reaching a lot of actors, a lot of stakeholders, and things are happening. Things very interesting things are happening between government stakeholders and public stakeholders and private stakeholders and social leaders. So I think this is the basic thing that we have to do as philanthropists, create this environment so everyone can speak and can have a communication between them. I think that is two key elements for philanthropy to do right now.
Thank you. I think I want to ask both Georgia and Aishwarya about this question. Sarah Ridley from the UK mentioned that systems right now are being shattered by COVID-19. I mean, in every country in the world, virtually. What are the benefits and challenges of a systems change approach when the world is changing so rapidly? Can you mention a couple of advantages or disadvantages or challenges? Maybe Aishwarya, if you can go first. India and Brazil and the US, 3 countries where we've got rapid change.
Right. So I'd like to take an example of first how systems were shattered because of the COVID, and how the systems change approaches actually probably stepped up and bridged those gaps and ensured vulnerabilities were not really aggravated. So for example, in India, when the lockdown was effected, there were a lot of essential, or we thought essential services, like protection services for women, like shelter homes, or even say government critical care centers. They were suspended because the government was prioritizing safety and healthcare as essential services, vis-a-vis, say, keeping women and girls protected, or even giving them a recourse to safe spaces, for that matter. If it would have not been identified as a ticking bomb, for that matter, by civil society organizations, or even by other players, like even corporate organizations who sort of had the foresight to see that this is going to lead to aggravated cases of violence with no recourse being available for women who are constantly facing that abuse. So while, of course, on one end, government was shutting down, say, shelter homes for women, for example, because they didn't want overcrowding, or even courts were just taking bail, sort of very, very specific cases, and all the other casework was sort of suspended. On the other hand, we have these organizations and partnerships crop up, which were putting in place, say, helplines, which were putting in place supply chains to ensure that women who are destitute are actually getting the services that they need. And I felt organizations like ours, which were sort of on the cusp, like we do not directly implement programs on ground, but we also sort of straddle both worlds, that we are in the funding sector, but we also have that visibility on what's the need on ground. We were able to sort of push more visibility on funding these kind of interventions because they were essential services in a way. So while we were trying to advocate for more funding support to be diverted to these kind of interventions, on the other hand, our organizations were also trying to advocate with the government systems on why define these as essential services, define helplines as essential services, define critical care help desks as essential services. So it was sort of like different players trying to push the needle in their own respective ways. And I was really amazed to find that there were a lot of even private individuals or some private corporate foundations who also understood that the need now was also on this, and not just say COVID as a homogeneous sort of entity. So I felt there we were actually, we've been seeing live cases of how multiple players and actors have sort of rallied around and collaborated to ensure that at the last mile things are moving, things are getting prevented, or things are getting addressed. And this wouldn't have been possible if it was only one organization or one corporate or one foundation working. It's because there has been constant sharing of data, constant sharing of knowledge, constant sharing of good practices on what's worked, what's not worked, what are the helplines available. Okay, I cannot do this, but can you, because you have a network in those places. So I think that has been like the whole vibrancy of the sector has really sort of come up very well during the time of this crisis.
Thank you. Georgia, what do you think?
I think I love the question that Sarah brought to us, and I think it's not the benefits and challenges for implementing system change. I think there's the only way out for the times that we are facing right now in the world is addressing things through system changing. And I'll give you an example that it's very appealing to us in Brazil right now. We have two major problems to address in Brazil right now. One is sanitation, another one is land tenure. Those things alone, isolated, are huge and very complex. One target city close to a very important urban area of Brazil, where we had a lot of mining effort in the past, Minas Gerais, the state of Minas Gerais. So a specific town over there is trying to address those two things combined. They have been working for the last 2 years addressing land tenure in urban areas together with sanitation. I will give you just one data about Brazil so you understand the context. 95% of the city lacks sanitations in our country. So imagine in a pandemic time right now with health issues, how sanitation is hitting us really bad. So going back to the example, this city is addressing those two things, sanitation and land tenure, in one urban area. And together, some philanthropists, some foundations are putting together some venture philanthropy concepts together with blended finance to address that. But first 2 years negotiating land tenure. Now we are kind of doing a plug and play with sanitation, with the land tenure minimal address. So we put the sanitation package, and then these people would be able to access sanitation through the service that the city could provide to an urban area who had no in the past land tenure issue, so they could not assess sanitation because they were not landowners in the past. So this is one example of how creative we have to act, and we are trying to solve those two things alone in Brazil. And maybe this is a good example of combining two complex issues in one combined solution would change things. And then if we make that specific area work, we can replicate the solution in other parts, in other cities in the Amazon and in other parts of Brazil. So this is one example. And I also love the way that Maria Claudia brought about how philanthropist is addressing the issue of taking risk. So we do that, but we don't talk much. A few foundations, they outspeak that, okay, we are risk-taking organizations. Some others are not. But the ones who are taking risks are not talking, are not sharing lessons learned, are not explaining and actually sharing how we are putting together our mitigation strategies to address risks. So I think exchanging information, and this reminds me that we are part of a Latin Pact, a network in Latin America to address venture philanthropy. And we have so much to learn and to share among ourselves, and we're trying to do that. And this is just something that comes to my mind, having open space to share and go back to the world that is quite different from what we left in February. And how can we be more creative with the tools and with the knowledge and with the things that we are learning as a group. I think it's all about people, and we have to change things, and it's in our hands.
Thank you, Georgia. That's a nice segue into the next question. Edwin, I want to ask you, a question came in about, is there an upside to collaboration in this period when most of us are working from home? You had the Skoll World Forum, which has been an anchor for social entrepreneurship for so many years. And this year you had to do it virtually. What do you see as opportunities, not only constraints, that we're getting from this period in terms of collaboration and networking?
Thanks, Heather. I think when it comes to collaboration, we really have to start by asking, what are you trying to do with the collaboration? What is the purpose? And is it underpinned by people who have the similar values that they're bringing to the table in terms of why they would want to collaborate? I think when you are able to start at that level, it enables then the most important thing, which is to start building trust. To be able to build trust so that you can get more open, that you can start to really unpack some of the jargon. I would say here at Skoll, we not only have English, we have MBA English, we have Silicon Valley English, and then we have Skoll Foundation English, right? So how do you unpack the jargon so that you're able to get real about what it is you're trying to collaborate on? And then this other point around then, how do you make sure that you recognize, and this is back to one of our own values, that we need to be constantly asking who else needs to be in this virtual room, right? Because you organize a panel of 200 people. You get 100 people, you get maybe 10 engaging, but you have to recognize even beyond that virtual room that there's got to be these through lines for the conversations to then be able to bring in, the very stakeholders, the stakeholder communities, the different sector players that need to be part of that conversation. So the opportunities around a virtual panel setting really enables more inclusion, and also enables us to then be able to carry this forward, to be able to say the through lines could go to other panels, to other virtual conferences. Before, and this is one of the things that we've assessed alongside our board, that having an invitation-only physical conference each year in Oxford, where you bring 1,200 people, heavily curated because you want the people who can actually get action out of the collaboration. But one of the benefits of having turned this on a dime to be able to then involve tens of thousands of people across a series of conversations over a given week in a virtual way is that it enables them the barriers to access to be broken in terms of people being able to then take part in these conversations that otherwise wouldn't be able to travel to a place like Oxford, right? So there's something about the beauty of being able to physically convene, because we're all humans, we seek engagement, There's something about being able to seed serendipity so that you're able to then have those conversations break free into hallways and into late night pub conversations. But there's also the ability now to bring in, how do we then start to point this in a direction where we can then include the very stakeholders that have to be part of this journey from the beginning in terms of collaboration.
Thank you, Edwin. Yeah, that reminds me, I've been reflecting this week. I think to some extent, networking has been democratized from the COVID-19 crisis it's an unintended consequence of a terrible tragedy. Kathy, we have about a minute left. I want to give the last word to you. The question came in about what are the first steps to breaking down silos? And I think you've done that as an individual, and I think Ford maybe still struggles with that, but is working on it. Can you share a few ideas? Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's such a good and tough question. I actually think that the times we are living in right now are give us incredible opportunities to bust those silos. For one thing, we all have a sense of urgency, right? For another, we have more of a sense of grace. Something about realizing that no matter where we are in the world, we are all having to cope with this pandemic. And we are all, those of us who are lucky enough to have jobs, are working with our children and our elders and our dogs and inviting people into your home space in ways you never intended has a way of deepening understanding as well. I think it's also very clear that no one silo is going to solve the COVID crisis. We need a scientific and technical solution. We need a vaccine for sure, an effective treatment. We also need public health solutions. We need economic solutions. We need solutions that recognize that Black and Brown people around the world are experiencing this pandemic in much more devastating ways, right? And so the problems don't lend themselves to siloed solutions, whether it's COVID or whether it's systemic racism or whether it's climate change. We need to understand that. We need to recognize that anytime we enter into a system, we have our own expertise that we need to share. And we also have far, far more that we need to learn, and we need to be open to learning and taking from others. We also, and this has been a lesson for me, not just in my work, but in my life, I need to not always put what I care about first. Right? I need to acknowledge that what others care about and what is most important to them sometimes needs to be addressed before we can even get to my issue. And I think that's something in philanthropy that we are not great at acknowledging. And it's something we have to get a lot better at.
Thank you, Kathy. So you can see we've got this amazing set of panelists. As Caroline said at the beginning, this has been recorded. So if you'd like to listen again, or if you want to forward it to your colleagues or people you partner with, we would love that. Please make sure to download the report and at least skim it. It's filled with a lot of insights like those we heard today.